I wanna know.
Jaheim Hoagland, or simply Jaheim, born May 26, 1978. Today's feature is about one of those everyday, rugged, potential superstars from the early 2000s, an artist who had hits we still remember and real momentum right out the gate. His debut went platinum, followed by another platinum album, and then a couple more gold records a few years later. Everything pointed toward him becoming a household name. He had a unique voice, a clear identity, and a loyal audience. But instead of crossing into true superstardom, his career settled into something quieter, consistent, respectable, but capped. And once you look at how R&B changed during that run, it starts to make sense why. What happened? Let's talk about it. Salute to Akeem Rashard on IG for this request. It's your boy JC, Stunted Growth Music. Let's get it, man. Take a minute to like, subscribe, and comment on who I should do next. Jaheim is an R&B artist from the early 2000s with a sound that immediately separated him from the pack. While much of the genre was moving toward polish and crossover appeal, his voice carried grit, pain, and a street-rooted realism closer to 90s soul. His 2001 debut album, Ghetto Love, made an immediate impact and went platinum, fueled by records like Could It Be and Just In Case. Instead of slowing down, his momentum continued. Still Ghetto followed in 2002 and also reached platinum status, confirming he wasn't a short-lived moment. By the mid-2000s, Jaheim had built a loyal audience and a clear identity. Albums released in 2006 and 2007 debuted strong, stayed on the charts, and kept relevant during one of R&B's most competitive periods. His music resonated with listeners who preferred realism over fantasy and substance over image. But as R&B gradually shifted toward youth-driven marketing, pop structures, and visually focused stars, Jaheim's lane began to narrow. The audience was still there, but the industry's priorities were changing, quietly pushing his style of R&B out of the mainstream spotlight. Stunt number 1, the sound the industry walked away from. I've always felt Jaheim came into R&B carrying a sound that was already losing industry support even while it was still connecting deeply with listeners. His music leaned into grit, pain, and lived in emotion, the type of storytelling that dominated 90s soul and early street R&B. Early on, that approach worked. There was still room in the mainstream for artists who sounded grown, imperfect, and raw. But as the 2000s moved forward, the business around R&B started changing faster than the music itself. Labels began shifting toward artists who were easier to package for radio, television, and younger audiences. Songs became smoother, shorter, and more pop-friendly. Image mattered more, and marketability mattered more. Jaheim's music didn't evolve in that direction, not because he couldn't, but because it wasn't who he was. His record stayed heavy, his perspective stayed grounded, and he kept speaking to real life instead of fantasy. That decision kept his audience loyal but limited his expansion. In an industry chasing scale, Jaheim's appeal was focused rather than wide. He resonated strongly with listeners who wanted honesty, but that honesty became harder to sell as R&B drifted toward crossover success. The genre itself was being repositioned, and artists who didn't fit the new direction weren't given the same priority regardless of past success. This wasn't about talent fading or relevance disappearing overnight. Jaheim didn't suddenly stop connecting with people. What changed was where the industry placed its energy. Promotional budgets shifted and radio priorities followed. Younger, more visibly driven artists became the face of the genre, while the kind of grounded R&B Jaheim represented quietly moved out of the spotlight. By the time the shift fully settled in, his lane was still there, it just wasn't growing anymore. And when an artist's biggest strength is tied to a sound the business is stepping away from, momentum slows without warning. Jaheim didn't lose his footing, the ground beneath him changed, and once that happened, staying central to the conversation became harder over time. Stunt number 2, a ceiling he couldn't break. Looking back, it feels like Jaheim ran into a ceiling that wasn't about ability or effort, it was about reach. He built a fan base early that genuinely connected with his music. Those listeners stayed with him, they bought albums, followed his releases, and understood exactly what he represented as an artist. That loyalty never disappeared, but over time it became clear the circle surrounding his music wasn't expanding the way the industry wanted it to. As R&B moved forward, labels started caring less about depth and more about scale. It wasn't enough to have devoted fans. Executives wanted growth across demographics, platforms, and age groups. Jaheim's appeal was strong, but concentrated. His core audience was more grown, grounded, and rooted in real-life experiences. That made his music feel authentic, but it also made him harder to sell as the genre began chasing younger listeners and crossover success. What stands out most is that nothing truly went wrong musically. He didn't suddenly start making bad records, and the people who supported him early didn't leave. In fact, many of them, including myself, stayed locked in. The problem was that the audience didn't grow fast enough to justify the kind of push newer artists were receiving. And in that era, perception mattered almost as much as performance. Once an artist was viewed as having capped growth, the industry adjusted accordingly. Rollouts became quieter, and promotion felt smaller and visibly decreased. Not because the work fell off, but the belief that something bigger was coming began to fade. Jaheim kept releasing music and stayed true to his lane, but that lane stopped widening. Over time, the gap between being respected and being prioritized grew more noticeable. There was no collapse, no moment of failure, just a gradual shift in attention. That's what hitting a ceiling looks like in music. Not a fall, not a flop, just a momentum slowing until it no longer climbs at all. Stunt number 3, the industry didn't know what to do with him next. The final thing that really limited Jaheim's growth was how the industry struggled to figure out what to do with him once his initial run cooled off. Early in his career, his lane was clear. He represented gritty, grown, street-rooted R&B. At a time, there was still space for it. But once the genre shifted and his sound no longer sat at the center of label priorities, there was no clear second plan. Jaheim wasn't someone the industry knew how to package. He wasn't going to pivot into pop records, chase trends, or suddenly reshape his image to fit a younger audience. His brand was honesty, emotion, and realism, strengths that don't always translate into reinvention campaigns. As newer artists came in with cleaner slates and more flexible identities, Jaheim felt increasingly locked into his original perception. That lack of repositioning matters more than people realize. Labels invest heavily in artists they believe still have another level ahead of them. Once that belief fades, support quiets dramatically. It shows in rollout size, radio backing, press runs, and overall urgency. Jaheim continued releasing music with the sense that each album needed to be a moment slowly disappeared. What's important is that this wasn't a collapse driven by controversy or decline in quality. His voice stayed intact, his themes remained consistent. The problem was that consistency alone wasn't enough any longer. The industry wanted evolution they could sell, internal and rooted in staying true rather than adapting, a feature I'm sure his fans appreciated. Over time, his career settled into a different space. He became an artist with a dedicated base but limited anticipation. Someone trusted but no longer prioritized. And once an artist reaches that stage, climbing back into the mainstream conversation becomes extremely difficult. No, Jaheim didn't fall off in my opinion. The industry just quietly pushed him aside for artists that fit where the game was headed. All in all, Jaheim's career makes sense once you view it through timing instead of failure. He came in with a sound that worked, found real success early, and built a loyal audience that never left him. But as R&B shifted priorities, the space for what he represented started shrinking. His music didn't fall off, the industry's focus simply moved elsewhere. Jaheim stayed true to his lane, and that honesty kept his core fan base locked in. At the same time, it limited how far the machine was willing to carry him once crossover appeal became the goal. Without a clear reinvention or new frame the industry could sell, his momentum slowed quietly rather than dramatically. He didn't disappear and he didn't collapse. He settled into a career built on respect instead of hype. And sometimes that's not a downfall, it's just a different ending than people expected when the run first began. Salute, much respect, but for these reasons, his growth was stunted. It's your boy JC, Stunted Growth Music, and I'm out.